tone. It might be a slight shift in aspect to the whole sonnet. You don't actually see the volta. It doesn't actually have any kind of physical existence on the page. It's just when the 8th line finishes and the 9th line starts, something has happened between the two. It might be marked by the word but or yet or something like that. Or if the first 4 lines begin with when and the second 4 begin with when, and the 9th line might begin with then. Again, we'll see this. So there are first 3 bits: octave, 8 lines; sestet, 6 lines. In between the two, you have this volta. The reason as to why the volta exists is open to question. Some people think that it's because the sonnet originally was a musical form, and so they would change key after the first 8 lines. So many different theories about why it might be there, but it is there, and we need to keep an eye on it, because sometimes it moves down to the 12th line, just because it wants to. But for the most part, octave, volta, sestet. Now, your octave, in turn, can be sliced in 2, into 2 quatrains. So, keeping in mind your basic 3-part structure, octave, volta, sestet, you can then look at your octave and cut it in half. Again, it's important to know how to cut these things up, how to dissect a sonnet, because that's what you'll be doing in the end of year exam. The sense couplet, or the rhyming couplet, is that bit at the end. The last 2 rhyming together do conclude the whole. The tercet, not used that often in English sonnets. Just as you can cut your octave, your first 8 lines, in 2, so you can cut in your Italian sonnet your sestet in 2, into 2 groups of 3. So there's a kind of mirroring effect. 4 and 4 plus 3 and 3. Again, it's really complex, and you can see now why it's getting into that kind of metaphysical crossword area. Because we usually just want poems, as we saw last week, to be kind of outpourings of emotion. But what you find in the early modern period, no, that's not allowed. Even if it is outpourings of emotion, it is caught in this kind of artificial framework, which is very complex and involves lots of reflections and movements and backs and forths. And every word of every sonnet, they all fit together. You can't take one bit of a sonnet away without the whole falling apart. So everything's got to be worked out. It's like a kind of a miniature painting. So these are all some of our terms. And for a laugh, here's some more. Again, you don't need to go too far with these. I've given you the main ones on that first page, but I'll mention some of these anyway, just in case. Rime crociate, which is cross meter. ABBA, ABBA. Now, before we go any further, we need to see how clear we are in terms of rhyme schemes. When you see the words ABBA, ABBA, is it fairly clear what it means? Are you excited about a Swedish supergroup from the 70s, or is doing something else? A, of course, is your first rhyme. It's your first line. It's the word that ends that. So, for example, the thing I reeled off before is, today I went to the pub and had beer. Beer, there is A. So, for example, the next line could be, some friends popped in and we got rather drunk. And drunk there would be B. So beer, then drunk. A, B. So that's the patterning you want to look for. A, B, B, A, B, B, A. That's a rima incrociate octave. The other type is a rima incatenate, which is A, B, A, B. What we in English often think of as alternate verse, alternating verse, alternating rhyme, or alternate rhyme. Again, we'll see these in practice, so we don't need to worry about them too much right now. Incrociate is where you get, for example, the word crucifix, just meaning cross, cruciform. Incatenate comes from the Italian word catena, meaning chain or link. So the rhymes are all linked together. This one, the third one along, you will not see very much of, but I thought I'd throw it in anyway, just to see what happens. Which is rima rovesciate, which is upside down rhyme. You find this in an Italian sestet from time to time. So you go C, D, E, and then the rhymes come down with a different direction. E, B, C. Goes up and then down. Dante uses this from time to time. Tenzone, don't need to worry about, not many of them in English, but it's worth knowing that it exists. It's just sonnets back and forth between people. So someone will send someone a sonnet, then they'd have to reply to that sonnet in the same rhymes. It's just people having fun. Tenor and vehicle, we do need to know, I think. It's an important part. A metaphor is divided into tenor and vehicle, basically. For example, if your tenor is your meaning, it's that which you are attempting to say or illustrate. So your tenor could be, I am so helplessly in love, my mind is all over the place. That would be your tenor. Whereas your vehicle would be the image of a ship caught in a storm at sea. So the tenor is the meaning, the vehicle is what you use to convey that meaning. And this is the basis of every metaphor. So it's important to have that, because lots of sonnets either use one consistent tenor and vehicle throughout, or they will use a few. Like you have one tenor and vehicle for your first quatrain, one for your second quatrain, and so on and so forth. Again, the types that I mentioned before, you've got the Italian sonnet, which is the Petrarchan sonnet, named after Francesco Petrarca, or Petrarch, who was a massive influence upon the whole early modern or Renaissance period. You've got the Shakespearean, or English sonnet, although as we'll see, there's some question over this, as to why we call it the Shakespearean sonnet. And the Spenserian sonnet, which is just the kind of, I don't know, like a pimped out version of the Shakespearean. Again, so just remembering the key terms. Octave, volta, sestet. Octave can be cut in two, means two quatrains. Sestet can be cut in two, into two tercets. Again, we'll recall these and we'll bear them in mind. So, let's have a look at some. One other thing I think should be mentioned actually is the voice of the sonnet, because for example, everyone who reads Shakespeare's sonnets concludes on the basis of those, oh, Shakespeare must have been gay, because he writes 126 sonnets to a young boy, and some of them are quite erotic. The speaking voice of the sonnet is not necessarily the author's voice. We have to bear this in mind throughout pretty much every piece of literature that we read. Even if the author is saying, no, this is me speaking, it's not necessarily the case. Something happens when writing begins that you'll find even if you write in a diary, you're writing in a kind of voice. And a sonnet is a long-established tradition. It's part of a long courtly poetry tradition which goes back to the High Middle Ages, which in fact goes way back to the classical period and the poetry of Ovid. So there are lots of conventions and traditional schemes and metaphors and similes, so that you're not actually writing as yourself, because all these different traditions get in the way, all these conventions that you have to use. So it's not the case that when someone's writing a sonnet, it's the author. It's best rather to think of the person who's speaking in the sonnet as the speaker, or in some cases, the poet-lover. Poet-lover. As we'll see. So as Michael Spiller mentions in his development of the sonnet, the text creates in its space a self, an I, who interposes between writer or speaker and reader. So this I is in the middle. There's the author, there's the I in the middle, and then there's the reader. So it's not just the case that it's a direct communication between author and reader. That's rarely, if ever, the case in literature. The sonnet's lyric voice is a dramatic construct. So we always have to bear that in mind. And Philip Sidney encapsulates this in his great sonnet sequence, Astrophil and Stella. I am not I. Pity the tale of me. That's just sums it up. Sidney says it better than I could. So we'll leave it there. Just remember that. I am not I. When you read these poems, I am not I. So where does it come from? Well, the sonnet is commonly thought of as the Renaissance form par excellence. But, in matter of fact, the sonnet is a late medieval form. It was created in 1230. So it's the dominant form of the Renaissance, but it was first invented in medieval Italy, late medieval Italy. It was invented at the court of Frederick II. He was a kind of enlightened monarch, the king of the two Sicilies, by a notary called Giacomo da Lentini, sometimes called Giacomo da Lentino. Those original sonnets written by da Lentini had octaves of rime incatenate, AVI, AVI. In the Italian sonnet, what you'll notice is that the sestet varies a lot. You can play with it. You can use all different kinds of rhymes. You can have C, D, D, C, E, E. You can have C, D, E, C, D, E. You can have C, D, D, E, D, D. You can play with it. Whereas in English, the sonnet tends to be a fixed form. It's the most famous fixed form, but as the Italian model shows, it's not always fixed. As Spiller points out, these early sonnets are much, they have a kind of objectivity to them. They are clear in what they're doing and what they're saying. So the sonnet is shaped at its beginning as a forensic instrument. so to speak, for pleading, arguing, asserting in a voice that is in control of worldly experience.